Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Pat Sullivan, Public Programs Manager here at the Agnes, and I'd like to welcome you all to this year's Francis K. Smith Public Talk in Canadian Art, an event named in honor of the first curator at the Agnes. This program relates to the exhibition, A Story of Canadian Art, as told by the Hart House collection, which is on view now in our galleries. The exhibition was organized by the Justina M. Barnaky Gallery, located in Hart House at the University of Toronto. We acknowledge the Government of Canada through the Museum Assistance Program for their support of the exhibition's production and its national tour. For our program support, we're grateful to the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Kingston Arts Fund. A Story of Canadian Art is finishing its tour, and as it's a collection belonging to a university, it complements the exhibition the Agnes held last year, namely Mind, Heart, and Spirit, the Queen's University Art Collection. Just as our nascent art collection needed the vision of dedicated alumni and friends to start buying Canadian art for an eventual campus gallery, so the University of Toronto, at an earlier period, required the foresight of Vincent Massey. Canada's first native-born Governor-General brought Hart House into being as a social, cultural, and recreational venue for students and encouraged the formation of a club that would acquire works of art. The exhibition provides us with an opportunity to discuss not only the reputation of this collection, but also to take a fresh look at one of the female artists included in it, Emily Carr. Our title, Iconic Canadian Art Today, Curating the Hart House Collection and Emily Carr, sums up the topic. I'll introduce our two speakers in a moment, but first I'd like to deal with that term, iconic. I think it refers to a work that, to borrow the ideas of curator Doris Shadbolt, has staying power, not only because of its artistic quality and sociological significance, but due to a unique blend of events that renders the work memorable. Such works become standards by which others are judged. Exhibition and reproduction in books contribute to a work's iconic status, but I'll leave the elaboration of that point to our two speakers. In the early 21st century, these paintings, while iconic, are no longer contemporary. How can we relate to them today? I'll introduce our two speakers now. They will each give a 20-minute talk. I'll follow up with some questions, then we'll open it up to the floor. Dr. Christine Boyanov Ski is an independent curator, writer, and lecturer based in Toronto. She has curated many exhibitions and written extensively in the field of Canadian art history. She is the curator of A Story of Canadian Art, as told by the Hart House collection, the catalog for which is available for sale in our publications lounge. Among her current projects is a study of cultural decolonization in the settler societies of the former British Empire between the two world wars. Sarah Milroy is a Toronto writer and art critic. She was the co-founder of the Canadian Art Foundation and served as editor and publisher of Canadian Art magazine from 1991 to 96, and was the chief art critic for the Globe and Mail from 2001 to 2010. Ms. Milroy has contributed to publications on the work of Gathy Falk, Jack Chambers, Greg Curnow, and Fred Herzog, and is a regular contributor to the Globe and Mail, Canadian Art, Border Crossings, and The Walrus. Recently, she co-curated From the Forest to the Sea, Emily Carr in British Columbia, which appeared at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London, England, and at the Art Gallery of Ontario, where it closed on August 9th. She will discuss Emily Carr's legacy today. Our first speaker is Dr. Boyanov Ski, who will address the Hart House collection. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Pat. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out on such a beautiful day. One of the employees here said, they were hoping it would be a mild drizzle so that people would be encouraged to come in, but it's really nice to see you all here. I don't know that this is going to take 20 minutes, but we'll see what happens. I was asked to curate the show of the Hart House historical collection, originally for the Art Gallery of Alberta. The works that you see in the show are not usually visible. They're usually held in storage. They no longer hang on the walls of Hart House as was originally intended. And that has to do with, and I'll mention this later on, that has to do with the conditions, the environmental conditions in Hart House, and the fact that these works have become very valuable, much more valuable, of course, now than they were in the 20s and 30s in terms of financial worth. So they are held mostly in storage. So this is a very unique opportunity to see these works together, together and look at the way that the collection has evolved over time. So I was really excited to be asked to curate this show, and I knew the collection well. I was an undergraduate at U of T. So that was in a period when these works of art were actually hanging on the walls of Hart House. And this is after 1972, because before 1972, women undergraduates were not permitted entry to Hart House unless they were accompanied by a male undergraduate or there was a special event, or I think there was one day a week where they could go. So. They were like old friends to me. And then when I was a curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario, when I began in the early 80s, lo and behold, the works of art were there being refurbished and awaiting the new Justina Barnicki Gallery, which I think opened in 1983, which did have environmental controls and all of that, and so the works could return. So when I was asked to curate this show, I thought, oh, this is wonderful. I know these works. And they indeed are like old friends, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with them as well. So I'll give you a little bit of information about the collection to give an indication of why they're well known or how well known these works are. Well, this is the installation in Edmonton, the first venue of a story of Canadian art. By the way, I didn't give it the title. I had some kind of academic title that didn't go over well with the marketing people, so they came up with this. And I actually quite like it because, as we all know, histories can be told in different ways. And this is just one, the story that I've chosen to tell through the works of art is just one way that these works could be displayed. It's one of the best collections of Canadian art from this period. That's 1920 to 1950. And it's been written about. There was a catalog of the collection, first published in 1955, written by Russell J. Harper, who did his master's thesis on the collection. And Russell Harper went on to write the history of painting in Canada, and Paul Kane and Craig Hoff. He was very well known. Canadian art historian Jeremy Adamson, who's also had a curatorial career, published a book in 1969 on the collection, bringing it up to date. And then the most recent example of an example where all the works were brought together was in the 1980s, and the exhibition was called Prevailing Influence, which looked at the influence of the Group of Seven on the collection. But I don't think there's ever been, since that time, an exhibition that includes more than just a few pieces. Now, in the 1970s, the Canadian Conservation Institute identified 59 treasures. These were considered to be the kind of the treasures or the best of the collection that were actually in danger. Physically in danger because of the environmental conditions. There's no air conditioning in Hart House. There still isn't to this day. The windows are open. There's the dry heat, so the humidity levels fluctuate quite a bit in the house. So it was recommended that these works be removed from the walls. Many of those treasures are in the show, you'll be glad to know. There are also many icons, and I liked your definition, Pat. I've defined it as works that stand for more than themselves, that they have taken on a meaning other than as a picture, as a view, or whatever, a portrait. They've become associated with Canadian identity. And on one of my many talks and tours, I followed this show around from the beginning through the last couple of years. And visitors, I would say all people, are really excited by these works. And one woman said, it's because they are us. And she identified on a very personal level with many of the works in the show, and you may agree with that. It's also interesting to note that they have kind of non-specific titles. Lismer's Isles of Spruce, for instance, doesn't give the title as Sand Lake, which is where he painted it, and Young Canadian, which is a portrait of Carl Schaefer, is known as Young Canadian. So I think that the way that these works have become known, or the way that they were entitled by the artists themselves, add to that iconic status, because then it's a sort of every man, or every young artist, or every young Canadian. This is one of the newspaper articles that appeared when the show opened in Edmonton, and you can see that, even now there's still these works are still identified with Canada, what they say about the country. Many of the works in the story of Canadian art have represented Canada at exhibitions abroad, and here we have Carmichael's Snow Clouds and Edward Holgate's Fire Ranger, both of which were sent to the Philadelphia Sesquicentennial in 1926. They were purchased from a show at the Art Gallery of Toronto, two separate shows at the Art Gallery of Toronto, which was kind of one of the venues which they generally looked to purchase works from. But before they even hung on the walls of Hart House, they were shot down to Philadelphia to be in the Canadian representation of that show. So this is kind of the works that show the kind of art that was representing Canada at the time. So they become more Canadian, I suppose, by being sent beyond the country, and they in fact are helping to create a brand. And I think that branding, which is happening in the early 20s, at the same time as Hart House has just been established itself, create a kind of there's a symbiosis that's happening between them. Now, Hart House is well known to many alumni, of course, all men until 1972. And the students used it, or the male undergraduate students used it as a house. They lived in it as a house. And you can see, here's a photograph from 1963, and you can see some of the well-known works just displayed in the workspace, and students studying or whatever in one of the common rooms. And I've explained why this no longer is the case. And there's Isolation Peak by Lauren Harris, and Isles of Spruce on the right by Arthur Lismer. The original, and there's an early shot of Hart House in 1920, just soon after it opened. But the original intention of an art collection was not to create the collection we know today. It was simply to decorate the house. It was known as Hart House. It was known as a recreational and cultural facility where undergraduates could speak, could have chats with their colleagues, with their professors, with graduate students. There was no pretension of creating a great collection of Canadian modern or contemporary art at that time. And I was really kind of puzzled when I saw, this is an early interior shot of one of the rooms of Hart House, one of the public rooms, and there were paintings on the wall that I know belonged to other galleries. So over the mantelpiece, you see a painting, a triptych by Mary Heister Reed, called Castles in Spain. Well, I thought, well, what's going on? What happened was they needed something to hang on the walls. It was a very stark, kind of neo-Gothic building, and they needed something to put on the walls. So they borrowed from the artists who belonged to the Ontario Society of Artists. So if the group of seven had not existed, if Vincent Massey and Bergen Bickersteth and Lauren Harris and A.Y. Jackson had not been on the scene, the collection would look very different today. It would have been like a hodgepodge of Ontario Society of Artists. The artists were working in all different various kinds of styles, from kind of Barbizon and Dutch influence to Impressionism, etc. But this was a moment of modernism in Canada, and a moment when the dominant ideology was nationalism. And all of these things, not just in painting and sculpture, but in music, in poetry, in literature. So it was everywhere. It was all pervasive. And these phenomena coming together at the same time and having the people there and the situations and the opportunities gave rise to this the collection as it is today. And of course, Vincent Massey, this is a portrait by Fred Varley, was painted in 1920 as a gift. It was commissioned by friends of Massey to give him upon the opening of Hart House to celebrate it. So this is a huge painting. I think Sarah said that when she first saw it in the flesh, so to speak, she was amazed at the scale. So it's also very important for these kinds of exhibitions, so that you can see the works of art. Sure, we now have very good JPEGs. We have digital images that we can access so easily now, but there's nothing like seeing the works themselves. So Vincent Massey, it was of course his idea to build Hart House in the first place, to honor his grandfather Hart Massey. So therefore Hart House. And he was also a great supporter of the arts. He later was on the board of trustees at the National Gallery, and he collected art himself, separate from the Hart House collection. So he was working behind the scenes. It was very interesting. When I was doing the research, I went through all the minute books of the art committee, and the art committee was the group that students and faculty advisors who purchased the works of art, who ran lectures, who did programming like Pat does, and there are things missing, very interesting. So I think there was a lot going on behind the scenes with Massey and Bergen Bickersteth and other people to make sure that this was going to be an excellent collection of Canadian art. And this evolved very quickly. Barker Fairley was the first chairman of the art committee. This is another portrait by Varley, again in 1920. He was a professor of German literature. He was a great friend of Group 7. There he is with his pipe at the end of the table. Beside him, on his right, is Lauren Harris, and then at the top of the table is A.Y. Jackson. And these three men were very important in the collection. So the first picture, which was purchased when Barker Fairley was chairman, was this work, Georgian Bay, November of 1921. It was purchased from the 1922 OSA, Ontario Society of Artists exhibition at the Art Gallery of Toronto. And it was this that set the precedent. This was the first painting by the Group of 7, apart from the Varley portrait of Massey, which came into the collection. So the history of the, excuse me, of the group of 7 is well known. It's been the subject of recent exhibitions, and so I didn't want to, in curating this exhibition, do the same show that has been done before many times, and that could be a chronological history, maybe focusing on individual artists. You know, there have been various approaches to this kind of work. So I thought, well, how can I approach it in a different way? Sorry. Very dry in here. So my methodology, which is reflected in the installations, was that I decided to explore the mechanisms through which these works entered the collection and then gained cultural currency. This isn't always apparent, and as I said, it doesn't always appear in the minutes. You know, usually it's recorded when a work of art is brought in, when it's purchased, how much it's purchased for, but there were interesting examples where there was silence, such as the wonderful 1947 painting by David Milne of Temagami. There's no mention, so I don't know. You know, I had to speculate on how it came into the collection. But how these works gained cultural currency, how they became icons, well, Pat's mentioned there's through exhibitions, through reproductions, through books, all of those things. So I thought, well, I'll look at not the works themselves so much as how they got into the collection and what was done with them. I have done, my doctoral research was looking at exhibitions of imperial art, or imperial exhibitions from this same period, which included Wembley, the exhibition where, the art exhibition where Canada was first praised so much by British critics. And this, of course, was relayed back in Canada and kind of put us on the map and made Canadians aware of this new movement in art. And I also looked at how countries were positioning themselves relative to each other and Great Britain, how they were promoting their own brands. So I thought it would be very interesting to look at the exhibitions in which these particular works that were hanging appeared. And these were sent time and time again to represent Canada abroad. And there's Wembley, there's the contemporary paintings or paintings by contemporary Canadian artists that went all through the United States in 1930, organized by the American Federation of Arts. And then in 1938, the Tate Gallery mounted a big exhibition called A Century of Canadian Art. And interestingly enough, Vincent Massey was behind the second two. In 1930, he was the first minister representing Canada in the United States, and the second time he was Canadian High Commissioner at the time of A Century of Canadian Art. So Vincent Massey is in there. He's making he's connected with the arts community, with everybody that needs to be talked to about this, and he promotes Canadian art in these two places. So that's very important, that there's so many collections that so many works of art in this show that were borrowed and continue to be borrowed. During the course of this small exhibition over 2 years, works have been borrowed for other exhibitions. For instance, the Emily Carr, which is here, was loaned out to Sarah's show. So that shows you the popularity and the demand even today for these iconic works of art. There's Bergen Bickersteth. This is after he retired. He was warden of Hart House from 1921 to 1947, and hugely influential and important. And I think a lot of behind-the-scenes activities happened. If there was never very much money. Often students were asked to donate a small amount of money each to buy paintings. But if they couldn't afford something, suddenly money would appear out of the Warden's Fund, and I have a feeling it might have come from the Massey Foundation. But none of this is recorded. Of course, it's speculation. So, one of the points, I suppose, there were three things that I tried to say with this show is that the collection was shaped in a specific way. It was very carefully thought through which works of art would be included. And in 1925, a collecting policy, now this is only after about 4 years, a collecting policy was established, and there were artists' advisors who helped in choosing the pictures. And the first committee was composed of Lauren Harris and A.J. Casson, the second committee of A.Y. Jackson and Casson again, and then a more conservative painter, so that there would be, it would be fairly distributed between the moderns and the more conservative artists. So here's a case in point. This is Isles of Spruce. Very high. This was in demand. This picture was. Both the Art Gallery of Toronto and Hart House both wanted to purchase this picture from one of the exhibitions at the Art Gallery of Toronto. In fact, it went through both their committees unbeknownst to each other. So there was a little bit of a conflict there, and of course, the art community was small, and they all wanted to be on good terms with each other. So Bickersteth wrote a stern letter to Haynes, who was the curator at the Art Gallery of Toronto, saying that we need this picture. We don't have a major picture. Well, neither did the Art Gallery of Toronto have a major picture of Lismer's. And he's agreed to lower the price for us. And this was true, that artists would give Hart House a lower price because it was going to Hart House. And in fact, it has all the trademarks of Canadian art as it was being defined at that time. It's a northern wilderness landscape, it's Algoma, it was painted by Lismer, et cetera, et cetera. So it was this kind of picture was very highly sought after. So Bickersteth argued for the painting. Here's a little sketch for that work, which is, thank you for installing it beside the canvas, Alicia, because I think it's important to see the two together. This was given to Bickersteth by Lismer when the work was acquired by Hart House. So that goes to show you, I think, the importance of the role that Bickersteth played. And there's the silkscreen that was produced in 1943 for enlisted men's barracks and buildings. This was the silkscreen project during the war. So of course, these works are continuously being put before the public. There was also, as the collection grew, and it grew slowly, a sense of history, a sense that they were building something important. And where did they fit into the history? And they started to see, well, okay, things are missing from the collection. They didn't have a major Thompson canvas. So here they went after, so now they're trying to fill in gaps. So you can see that now the collection starts to take shape. So they went after this very well-known picture, The Pointers, which has, I always say, it's traveled more than any of us. It's been everywhere. It was in the Dulwich exhibition of Tom Thompson and the Group of Seven, and it was purchased from the late Tom Thompson's sister. The same with J.E.H. MacDonald. When he died in 1932, there was no major canvas of him to represent in the collection, and this was purchased from the estate from his son Thoreau. And also, because of Harris's involvement with the collection, they wanted to represent him very fully. But this picture which was painted in the 20s, was not actually acquired until the 40s. I think they had trouble with this one. It was getting a little abstract. And definitely, this one would not have probably gone over very well, except that it was Harris, and Harris had to be well represented. So all aspects of his career. Another important thing to consider is that they continued to collect during the Depression, and I think this is again where Massey and Bickersteth made a difference. There was some money given through the Massey Foundation to the Hart House collection in order that it could still purchase works of art, and this is one of the examples. This is the Young Canadian, which of course is one of the icons. And there's that picture by Milne that I mentioned that suddenly appeared in the collection in 1947. Massey had owned it in his own collection since the 1930s, but suddenly when there was a show of Milne's in 1947 organized by Douglas Duncan, I guess Massey realized that there was no major Milne, so he gave this picture. But again, there's no documentation. Just quickly, here is, I've probably exceeded my time, have I, or am I okay? 2 minutes, okay. The fact that these pictures were shown abroad. This is the first exhibition, the British Empire exhibition at Wembley, the Canadian, one of the Canadian galleries, and you can see about halfway down the wall on the left, the Varley portrait of Massey. In the exhibition by contemporary Canadian artists that went to the United States, the Emily Carr Kitwankul totems was included, and also in that exhibition was Comfort's Prairie Road, which is an amazing piece of art for its time. It was not in the collection, but it was acquired soon after. So not only were works being borrowed from the collection to send overseas, but the collecting committees at Hart House were picking works from these international exhibitions. So as the history of Canadian art was being written through the exhibitions, as the work was being produced, Hart House was being written into, by purchasing these works, by owning them, by displaying them, was being written into the history. So I see them being interwoven, partly because as Canadian art was developing in the 20s and 30s, so was the collection. So that's a kind of a different way of looking at the collection. At least that was my intention. And there's the poster for the British London Transport poster for the Century of Canadian Art with Holgate's portrait of Ludovine. And I think it's interesting that now, at the end of the 30s, there's a portrait. It's not just strictly landscape, wilderness landscape. And there's an installation shot from that Tate Gallery exhibition, which, and the purpose of that exhibition was to show that Canada wasn't just the group of seven, but we had a much longer history of art. Well, they didn't really have a very good understanding, because you've got a combination of sort of westernized portraiture with French-Canadian wood carving, with argillite carved totem poles and a Chilkoot ceremonial blanket from the West Coast. So this was all just, oh yes, we go a long way back through our native peoples, and that may be something that Sarah realized would have to be rectified. Because there was this growing sense of, yes, Canada does have an art history, and they wanted to write it. And well, those are two of the pictures which were in the Tate exhibition. This is an article that appeared in the 1940s in Canadian Art, written about the collection. And then, of course, J. Russell Harper, 1955, writes the catalog. So, and the story continues, because as long as the works keep being requested for exhibition, they're put in new contexts, and they continue to gain a history. And that gives them more meaning. And so on we go. Thank you. Take my water with me.
Thank you, Christine, for that great look at the Hart House collection. I'll just open up Sarah's PowerPoint here. Okay, so please welcome Sarah Milroy to talk about Emily Carr.
Thanks so much. Thank you. I was saying just before we started to Christine that one of the great things about today was the chance to come on the train from Toronto with Christine, spend the day with her, and go back to Toronto with her again tonight, because we've never really had a chance to sort of hang out and talk about Canadian art together, and now we're having a whole wonderful day of it thanks to all of you and the folks here who have invited us. I wanted to start by just responding for a second to what Christine showed us, because I think one of the things that I found so moving about this show when I saw it in Toronto was this sense of a time in Canadian history when art was seen as such a fundamental and important part of how a nation would express itself. You know, the confluence of extreme wealth and influence with artistic practitioners at the very highest level, with the institutional buy-in of the university that made Canadian culture a high priority. Like, it's funny to think, we think we progress in Canada, you know, but they had something in the 1920s and 30s in Canada that we still wish we had today, just as we had many television shows and radio shows about Canadian art and culture in the CBC in the 1960s and 70s. Whenever I do primary research, I'm always struck by the amount of material that is accessible through archives about the art practice of those times. And I think obviously the consolidating work of Hart House was really important in those periods, and so we need to remain activist about insisting that our governments and institutions continue to do what institutions like the CBC and Hart House did so well. So, I mean, for me, that was one of the really sweet and bittersweet things about your exhibition. It demonstrated that so beautifully. And they are, I don't know how many art history students are here today, but it really was a huge thrill for me to walk in and see that Varley portrait of Massey. It is, I mean, I was looking at it again today thinking, you know, is it the best portrait that's ever been painted in Canada? It's certainly one of the top 5. I mean, what would you put there, Christina? We'd put, you know, Harris's Salem Bland, and I mean, there wouldn't be Emily Carr's self-portrait, maybe there wouldn't be many contenders. It's just an astonishing thing. So thank you for everyone in the Canadian art world for making all these things available to all of us again in this beautiful way. So Emily Carr, iconic, yes, and also beloved. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is the fact that when someone is beloved, as Emily Carr is, that can be a blessing, of course, because people are interested in seeing the pictures, but it can also be a kind of curse, or at least a challenge, because people think that they know this person. And I used to get 2 kinds of reactions from people when I would say I was doing an Emily Carr show when I started working on it almost 4 years ago now. And that was either, oh, Emily Carr, I love Emily Carr and her monkey, and she was just so great and fabulous, and she was at one with Native people, and, you know, I'm her biggest fan. And you'd kind of go, okay, we've got some work to do here. Or else you'd be talking to a contemporary art colleague, and they'd say, Emily Carr, really? Like, that boring? You know, like, what could we possibly learn about Emily Carr? Like, isn't she sort of done to death? So it was sort of this familiarity thing that you know, presented really 2 conflicting types of challenge. And I've just gathered some sort of horrendous examples of ways in which Carr has perhaps been characterized and caricatured historically. This is Joe Fafard's evocation of the artist in front, which stands in front of Heffel's, appropriately, a temple of commerce in Yorkville, and which catches her in a seriously bad hair day with apparently her flesh decomposing, but never mind. And of course the monkey riding high on the back. This is what happens when you become iconic. Beware. This is in Victoria, again, Carr with the monkey on her shoulder, on her back, you could even say, the monkey on her back of fame, and her beloved dog. But I think, there's another Fafard here, a picture of her, again, with a dog looking even more scowly than she did before. So clearly, two things are being emphasized here. Her sort of frumpy, old bag lady persona, but also her as a kind of caretaker of animals. And, in fact, the interesting thing about Carr is that she was, of course, a pioneering artist, a feminist who wouldn't probably have thought of herself as a feminist, but definitely a feminist, and just in the fact that she wanted to live her own life. And one of the main ways in which she achieved that was by not, in fact, being a nurturer with most of her time. She was not a mother. She was not a wife. She very deliberately chose not to be. And I find it very interesting that the persistent image of Carr is as a nurturer. It's almost as if that corrective has to be given kind of in a way that is almost punitive in historical hindsight. I've become very interested in Carr and her monkey and Frida Kahlo and her monkeys. But anyway, that's someone else's PhD thesis. Women who didn't have babies and had made art instead. And yes, it's really extraordinary. We wanted to lift off these the sort of carapace of narrative that had kind of accumulated around Carr, and sometimes by virtue of her own writing. Carr was not insensitive to how to become a national icon, and her writing is really, some of it is absolutely wonderful. I'm going to read you some of it from her journals as I conclude. But a lot of her writing is very self-consciously positioning herself as a national icon, as the feisty, Apple doll of Canadian art. Like she was not, she knew how to do that. She knew what she needed to be and do to become a national treasure. And so she's partly to blame for this. But we wanted to strip away that and allow people to have a fresh look at the work. I've included here The Crazy Staircase, which is the work that recently sold through Heffels for $3.4 million. What's really interesting about this is that it's not a very good painting. In fact, one of the really hard truths about Emily Carr is that she is one of Canada's most uneven artists, which is something that no one really dared ever say, because everything ever made by Emily Carr was a work of genius. This, I don't believe, is a work of genius. It's very crudely painted. It has a certain bombastic tone about it. This is made after she comes east in 1927, when she has this sudden sense of an audience for the first time in her life in eastern Canada. And she makes a series of paintings, a few of which, like Kitwan Cool Totems, are gems. And again, my apologies for having to filch that from your tour. But it really is one of the signal accomplishments of her career, that picture. But most of the pictures from this period have this kind of near hysterical histrionic tone, and are actually quite woodenly painted a lot of the time, but are nonetheless seen as national treasures. We wanted to strip all this away and really look carefully at the work and get back to who this wonderful human being was, with all of her awareness of the gulf that separated her from the Indigenous people that she was so fascinated by. A woman who was prescient enough to be able to understand the problems of the residential school system, and actually advocated to some Aboriginal women that she knew not to allow their children to be taken. She who understood that the missionaries were the uncivilized ones, that were exhibiting such a lack of compassion and insight into the people over which they had been given charge. She was very unusually intelligent in terms of her ability to be introspective about the cultural biases of her own culture, and really unusual in her willingness to be curious and friendly and open-minded about a world that everything in her society was telling her to disparage. So who was this person, and how could we bring people closer to her? I love this picture because it's a missionary girl sitting behind her with her. She's sort of emblematic of, someone who's trying to keep the elements away from her, the umbrella serves as a kind of prophylactic against anything, penetrating her consciousness, and then this Aboriginal woman who is her guide on the other side be like, oh, yoy, crazy white folks, and Carr in the middle just looking like she couldn't possibly be having a better day, with Billy, her dog, just, anything was better than staying at home in Victoria with her sisters, who were so uptight and disapproving of her. She just was always in her element. We became, in contrast to the kind of crazy staircase type of work that abounded, the oils on canvas that abounded, particularly after 1927, Ian Desjardins, who was the co-curator of this show at the Dulwich Picture Gallery, Ian and I became very interested in the works on paper, in which Carr often reveals herself as a much more, humble and open and sensitive recorder of the world around her. We find a beautiful sense of inquiry in this oil painting. Of course, it shows that she's been to France. She's been exposed to post-impressionism. She got herself to London, to art school, to San Francisco, to art school, to Paris, to art school. This is a single woman traveling in the first decades of the 20th century. It's really quite extraordinary. The luckiest break that ever happened for Canadian art is that Emily Carr's two parents died when she was in her teens. And this meant that she inherited just enough money that she could get herself, she could direct her own life. And she fortunately had an executor who respected her enough as a person to, endorse her doing that. But you can see here that she's been to Europe and been trained. We love, here's her actually making sketches for the work in Tanu. You can see her figure just right here. Kind of crouched down in the weeds, making her sketches of that site. We thought these were a revelation, the works on paper. This was in a private collection. We went back 40 years and tried to find every work that had traded through the auction houses and then track them all down and find images of them and then start the begging process, which was prolonged. But we actually found people very, very excited about the idea of a different take that emphasized the works on paper. And this one is particularly extraordinary, and it's a sort of expressionistic sweep of that foreground, the very bright colors. Again, a lot of these things were not very highly prized because they're works on paper, so they sat in storage, or they were wrapped, or they were thrown in cupboards somewhere in the dark. And so a lot of them were just fresh as fresh can be, and we were able to show them for the first time in decades and decades. This is another example where the loose brushwork in the grasses in the forefront really give you that sense of the wind moving through the trees and everything being interconnected with these forms. And again, I think this is a way in which her way of painting, what we tried to explore was that the interconnectedness of things in these watercolors are very much like when you look at the composition of Northwest Coast objects, where wolf gives way to beaver, gives way to whale. There's a kind of way in which everything sort of sings together, and that her way of looking at the world really was quite harmonious with that view, even though she came from a completely different cultural tradition, obviously. She wanted to give all of her watercolors of the coast to the province of British Columbia as a gift. Well, first she wanted to sell them to the government, then she wanted to gift them to the government of British Columbia, and they declined the gift, saying that they were too colorful to be of any value as an ethnographic record. Okay, the next slide is going to be a picture of the show installed in London. And you'll see that it's not just an exhibition of Emily Carr's paintings, that what we did was actually go to the collections of Northwest Coast art that were in the museums in the UK, such as the British Museum, the Pitt Rivers in Oxford, the Horniman in South London, Edinburgh and Ipswich and so on, and borrow these extraordinary objects that had been taken from the coast in some cases as early as the late 1700s. We had a gull mask from Captain Cook from the first British landfall on British Columbian soil in 1778 at Nootka Sound that was included in our show. We went to the mall because we knew that we didn't want to make a show that showed an Emily Carr painting and beside it a mask that looked like it, which had been kind of what had happened with Emily Carr shows in the past, is that there was a sort of a strenuous desire to suggest kindredness between the two. And while there were some things about the worldview that seemed to be echoes of each other. They were totally different worlds. And in fact, Carr very clearly understood that. Not all the critics of the time understood that, and she was often sort of treated like an honorary Aboriginal person by the press of her day and still today. But in fact, she understood that this was a great mystery to her, how this culture worked, and the belief systems and customs of Aboriginal people. And so what we did is to put the space back between Indigenous culture that was in fact her inspiration and her paintings, actually physically putting the objects in the middle of the room. We did this in Toronto as well, putting the objects in the middle of the room and then placing the paintings in their own zone further out. So here you'll see some iconic works that have been kind of recontextualized here. The mask in the middle that faces you is a woman of high rank mask from the Haida people, and we wanted there to be the woman of high rank mask when you walked in because Emily Carr is a woman of high rank, and so we were playing with kind of subliminal messaging here. You'll see on the back wall Totem and Forest, and beside it Indian Church, which are kind of speaking of two different systems of belief systems, cultural systems, the white geometry of the European Christianity and the more integrated into the landscape totemic shape of the totem pole. We were not having a lot of success getting the British museums to play ball with us. We were not getting our phone calls returned. We were trying strenuously to explain how excited we were about this and how great that these objects were there in England, and we were just getting nowhere. So by chance, I had the opportunity to spend some time with Jim Hart, who's an Aboriginal hereditary chief and master carver, incredible artist, who was carving his big double screen for Michael Ledane at the Vancouver Art Gallery at the time on the 4th floor. And every time I would go home to see my father in Vancouver, I would go to the VAG and he would be there. And finally one day, we got to talking. He said, "Well, what are you doing?" Because we were talking always about what he was doing. And I said, "Well, I'm doing this show on Emily Carr." He said, "Oh, Emily Carr." He said, "Yeah, she's terrific. She used to come up and stay in my great-grandfather's guest house in Masset." And I was like, "You don't say." So we started talking about that. And he said, "Yeah, she made a really great painting. I think it's called Totem and Forest," which of course is Carr's masterpiece. It was my family's pole, And then he started talking about the story on the pole and the fact that the pole is actually still in Masset. It's a monster of a pole. It's like 8 feet across at the base, and it's wrapped up in plastic in Masset right now in a shed where it's quite safe, but, it's still there. And he had this very first-hand relationship to it. And so I thought, what an incredible addition to an exhibition on Carr to be able to have a voice like that talking about looking at Carr's work as an Aboriginal person, and in particular from his own, family position. So you'll see. We also found, to the right of the woman of high rank mask you can just see kind of a brown mass that's up under the wall label beside Indian Church. That was a raven mask that was, by Jim's account, given by one of his great-great-grandfathers who was a shaman to a British missionary in the 1860s, and it's been sitting at the Pitt Rivers Museum. When we went to visit it, we looked at the tag and the information. He was able to say, "Oh yeah, it's my old great-granddad," the curator almost dropped dead with excitement. So anyway, it all worked out wonderfully well, and we in the end got every single thing we wanted when Jim came back to London with me, and we did those visits again, and that's why we were able to do so well. So Jim was, an essential part of our success. And this is just to show you some of here's his family pole, which tells the Bear Mother story, and which I won't go into, but it's a doozy if we have time at the end. And just to show kind of what, we did it with a light hand, but just to show the way in which, the carving traditions did certainly affect Carr in the kind of, reduce the gesture, make a clear decision about line, the kind of disciplined use of color. There are real harmonies there to be explored without reducing anything. One of the other things we really wanted to deal with was the notion of Carr as a kind of creature of emotion, sort of swooning in the back of a canoe, having epiphanies. We wanted to really show people that Emily Carr was a very hardworking person who really struggled to educate herself. And so one of the things we included was a series of drawings that she actually made in Eastern Canada visiting museums when she came east for the 1927 show that she was in that was so pivotal in her life. She spent hours drawing from objects that were in the museum and also drawing from anthropology textbooks of the day, in particular Boaz and Swanton. She would kind of slavishly try to figure out how to make those ovoid forms and have them fit together. So when we did the show in Toronto, we offered the audience clipboards and paper and pencils to try to do what she did, which is to make really kind of uninspiring drawings. I mean, they're not in the show because they're great drawings. They're in the show because they show her struggling with the image and struggling to do justice to something that she understood was beyond her capacity to really truly grasp or achieve on a formal level. We also wanted to kind of disabuse people of the idea of her as a Canadian artist in a Canadian context only, and our hero and our Emily. In fact, you know, I mean, that's just as a feminist, that was one of the other things, is that everyone calls her Emily. Even the exhibition team in England, I had to reprimand from calling her Emily because she's Carr. You know, we don't say Tom for Thompson. We don't say Fred for Varley. You know, why are we saying Emily for Carr? So anyway, she, Carr traveled, as I said, extensively to receive her artistic training, and she also got herself to New York in 1930, where she met George O'Keeffe, who was showing the Jack in the Pulpit series at that time. George O'Keeffe also turned her on to D.H. Lawrence while she was there. And in Carr's journal, she writes about, she doesn't understand what all the fuss is about D.H. Lawrence, because all he writes about is sex, and he's a pervert, and he really should be ashamed of himself, and then she goes home and paints this. So it's really kind of intriguing to me. But it's also, you know, such an extraordinary image around sexuality. To me, it's like both sort of labia-like at the bottom and phallic. So it's this kind of bigendered object that takes, you know, O'Keeffe's insight and extends it into kind of any kind of sexual variance that you could imagine. I think it's really an extraordinary painting, and we were lucky to have it in both shows. But so Emily Carr is an international artist interacting with international art, not just getting, you know, the high five from Lauren Harris and, you know, heading for the barn. There's more to the story than that. We wanted to make that clear. We also know that she saw Duchamp's new Descending a Staircase with Lismer, actually, when she was on that trip to New York. And the big task of the whole latter part of her career was depicting motion in a static object. And, you know, I really do think that you can feel a sense of the Duchamp precedent in that the faceting, it's a very peculiar picture of a tree. It's a funny color. It's blonde in a way that doesn't really bear relationship with the environment itself. And it has a kind of, you know, faceted sense of movement in the tree trunks on the bottom that to me is highly suspicious. So this could be an example of fancy on my part, or it could be, you know, really important. But I think it's there. And we know that, I mean, she took note of seeing the painting. It's in her journals as being an important thing to have seen. And she says that Lismer said it was very feminine, the Duchamp. So we need to digress and talk about Lismer, but not today. The other thing we wanted to show people was that her inspirations were not just Northwest Coast art and not just the visual art made by other visual artists, but also literature was very, very important to her. She was an avid reader of poetry all the way through her life, for example. And Whitman, when you go to BC Archives in Victoria, there are boxes of her books that she had at the end of her life. She has 5 different editions of Whitman there, all of them annotated with either with red pen in the margin indicating her favorite poems. This one, Miracles, is always, and you can read the text there. It's basically about being in a sense of wonder and astonishment. I mean, the relationship between Whitman and Carr is very interesting, both I think otherly gendered, otherly sexualized, and both having an unusual affinity with First Nations people. Whitman writes about the Isle of Manhattan and is always kind of insisting upon the Aboriginal presence in America in his writing. And both, I think, probably certifiably manic in their dispositions. They both were given to extraordinary mood swings. I mean, keeping up, you really have to saddle up when you read Emily Carr's journals, because the highs are so high and the lows are so harrowingly low, characterized by that painful self-doubt that is so much a hallmark of that mental illness. But boy, when they rave, and I think she felt a special affinity for Whitman. So there's another PhD thesis that someone needs to write. But to me, every hour of the light and dark is a miracle. Every cubic inch of space is a miracle. The sea is a continual miracle. The fishes that swim. So, this really could be Carr writing these things. And just for those who speculate about Carr's sexuality, this is one of my personal favorite finds in the archive from the Song of Myself. Oh, the horsemen's and horsewoman's joys, the saddle, the gallop, the pressure upon the seat, the cool gurgling by the ears and hair. And she writes in the margin, I've felt it. So I think that's a wonderful thing to come across in the library. And here she's feeling it, looking at happiness. This was Ian Desjardins' favorite painting in the show, and indeed the British critics went crazy for this period of Carr in the 30s when she's working with oil and gasoline, the gasoline to thin down the oil paint so that she can move the brush like watercolor but still have the opacity and the brilliance of oil paint. These are spontaneous, quick studies made in the field. They're large in scale, very unusual to make works on paper of that scale. And she would make dozens a day and throw away the ones she didn't like. A whole room full of these ocean and sky studies that, again, were very warmly received in the UK. And we had many, many people come to us in Toronto and say, we didn't know these works. We didn't know these works. We knew Crazy Staircase. And you kind of go, oh. Because these are just among the most gorgeous works of art that have ever been produced in Canada, and they were on paper, which partly, explains why they were not as well known. This glorious late work on paper, which is, Beacon Hill Park, where Carr, she started her life there as a young girl running around in the fields. She ended her life there, usually in a wheelchair, being pushed out to the end of her street. Beacon Hill is right at the end, it's on the bluff at the end of her street. In downtown Victoria, but she was at this point, she had, as Whitman would have put it, had all the worlds within her already. She could take that, find that euphoric state of connection to the natural world wherever she went. And we had this at the end of the show in both venues because it just is evidence of a life, an imagination, a human being that was able to, against all odds, completely express everything she had inside her. And I think are we at the end of our time? I think I'm going to stop there, but thank you so much for your kind attention and your forbearance about our technological difficulties, and thank you for being here today.
So you've both talked about the process of disentangling Emily Carr or any other artist from their canonization. I wondered if there was anything else you each wanted to say about that process, how one goes about it and makes that disentangling apparent to an audience. Who'd like to go first?
Well, first of all, why would you want to disentangle?
Well, sort of like Sarah said, if the canonization
wanting to clear away some of the stuff that had accumulated around the work that maybe was making people unable to see it in a fresh way.
Well, because I think that's part of the history.
It is, yeah.
I think, but to make people see things in a new way. But I think it's also important to acknowledge those messy bits.
Yeah, the history of the discussion around them.
That's right, because that comes out of a particular period or.
Well, what was so interesting is that, like in London, we were presenting a person that we really did want to strip down and show fresh because they had never heard of her before. So we wanted to give them as the least hackneyed, pre-cooked version of her that we could, and show what we thought was the best work and so on. In Canada, you have to deal with those histories and the discourse that is gathered around her, and in particular in relationship to her treatment of First Nations themes. So it almost had to be two completely different like, you have to conceive of it completely differently for the two venues, and yet still make one publication that serves both audiences. So that was, I found that challenging.
Sarah, you, in showing us the Emily Carr exhibition, you talked about the inclusion of First Nations objects in that show. What did you learn a lot through the course of making this exhibition about your own ideas about First Nations people?
Well, I think one of the things that I've just been finishing writing this week about Kent Monkman, who's a contemporary Cree, Anglo-Irish, Canadian artist. And, when you work as a white person with First Nations material, you're always self-consciously analyzing your own instrument of perception. And I think, certain ideas that flow in Canadian culture and in settler culture, such as the idea that, Aboriginal people are somehow more connected to the natural world than other kinds of people. Like, some Aboriginal people claim that, other people say that's a racial stereotype. So you realize how complicated your own place is as a speaker within that discussion. I think you become more self-conscious in a way, and more self-scrutinizing. So, in writing about Kent Monkman, who's making a diorama at the Gardner Ceramic Museum, which will open next week, he's building a buffalo jump for mischief inside the Gardner Ceramic Museum. But, I ended up really going back and thinking about dioramas and how dioramas teach young people. And then I suddenly realized, wait a minute, I went repeatedly to the diorama in Banff, which is one of the most egregiously, racial caricature dioramas you could ever hope to find. Repeatedly all the way through my childhood, and I'd completely forgotten that. And then I started to write about that and about what I might have learned from that experience. So you're just constantly, and then then you're thinking, well, yeah, and actually I remember women from the First Nation across the water from where our cabin was in the summer used to come and sell baskets. And what was that like for me as a child, looking at those children, and stuff that you don't even know or things that you don't even know that you've incorporated, you start to examine and become aware of. So there was enormous learning there, and hopefully some enlightenment. Yeah.
Thank you. Christine, my last question is for you. You conclude your essay in the Hart House catalog by saying that new ways of engaging with the collection will evolve in the future, so a collection that's usually in storage. How do you see that happening? Do you care to speculate on these new ways?
Well, I'd have to speculate because I'm not a resident curator at Hart House, or the Justina Barnaky Gallery has just been newly incorporated, or the UTAC has been brought together with the Justina Barnaky, which makes it possible for them to show not just contemporary work, which has always been the mandate of the Hart House Art Gallery, aka Justina Barnaky, but also historical work. And when this show came to Toronto, it showed in UTAC. It showed in the not the Justina Barnaky, but the other venue. So they have all kinds of ideas, I'm sure, about what they're going to do. Personally, I feel technology will probably be more used to personalize the experience of being there in a meaningful way. I don't think it's always done with a great deal of thought. But also to make, because it's a social thing, we can look at art on our own, but I think part of the excitement or the learning experience is to go with someone else, and maybe you've all come with someone today, so that you can talk about things and the energy that you create discussing the work and looking at it. I always find it's interesting to go through with practicing artists because they see things that I don't see.
Totally.
And I think it will be more personal. I hope that it doesn't, that museums don't just disappear. The curators are still, are still useful
Well,
in museums, because sometimes you just don't know.
But when you say personalized, you mean interactive, like that the gallery goer would contribute in some way in the show, or what do you mean by personalized?
Well, I would say that you get something out of it as an individual, and I'm not quite sure how that would. We were talking on the train coming up here, and I did a project in 1996 called Reading Pictures. Pat, you probably remember that because we worked closely when Pat was also at the AGO. And we invited contemporary writers to respond to works of art in the collection. So they would write something, we recorded them reading the work, and then they were all compiled onto a tape, onto an acoustic guide. So the individual visitor could walk around with a map. You know, you could do your own guided tour, you could go to the works in whichever order, and then you have this reading by a writer who are often very sensitive to works of art, visual art, and suddenly the works reveal themselves in different ways. That to me is, you know, because you're with the writer and you're seeing the work through their eyes or through their interpretation. So it has a personal resonance for you. I don't think it's about writing your comments in a comment book, or I like your idea of the drawings in Emily Carr. That was interesting.
We wanted people to have the humbling experience of trying to do it, because it's like you get halfway through an ovoid and you realize I'm way out of my depth. I can't even imagine how to fit these shapes together. So the young people in particular ended up loving it because there were a lot of masks in the show in Toronto, and the kids were pretty engaged by them. Big, huge quack-doodle whale mask and some wonderful bears. And
I like the things with the strings, the movable parts.
Yeah.
Because I didn't realize that they're worn during a dance, and they're almost like marionettes. You pull pieces and
the fins go up and down.
No,
I mean, we actually had some interesting discussions about that, because there were masks that in Toronto we borrowed from the Museum of Anthropology, which is a great and very progressive institution, very generous. And we had a choice often between masks that were really pristine and, you know, polished and no dings on them. And then there were other masks that had clearly been used. They were more recent. They had all their rope rigging was still attached to them, and they'd been banged up because they'd been used. And we ended up, you know, I thought, what is it going to look like to put these, which interested me more, into the museum case? You know, are they going to look like kindling that, you know, like, what are we doing with these things here in the museum? But in fact, they really held their own, and they really, I think, did express a sense of objects that were of use, that had seen a lot of heavy weather and still had all this personality. But there was a moment of like, will they survive the translation from the storage vault in the museum, where they're so alive, to the more kind of rarefied atmosphere of a museum display? But thank goodness they did. I think they looked wonderful. But
Okay, thank you.
Not precious, but vivid. Yeah.
Thanks. I think now I should open things up to the audience, so I hope some of you have questions. And because we're recording this event, we have Bruce and Alicia, who each have a handheld mic. So if you put your hand up and make yourself known as a questioner, one of them will come to you. And if you could hold the mic close to your chin, we'll be sure to hear your question.
Hi, I just want to thank you both for giving the wonderful presentation today. I really enjoyed it. And the question I have is about, you were talking about, Sarah, you were talking about Emily Carr and how she'd offered to donate her art to the province of British Columbia, and they declined it, and you weren't able to finish the story because of the technical interruption.
Oh, yes.
I was just wondering if you could finish that.
Well, what happened was that she, first of all, wanted to sell it to the province of BC, and they didn't express any interest. And finally, she was willing to gift it, is my recollection, and they still wouldn't receive it because they said because it was so highly colored and so expressionistic, it could not be seen as a valid record of the traditional villages of the coast. Yeah. And it was that moment, you know, she'd been to San Francisco, she'd been to London, she'd been to Paris. You could make a strong argument she was the most advanced artist in Canada at that time in terms of her awareness of international art, or certainly one of them. She kind of hit the wall and decided that this wasn't going to work, and she would maybe be a Sunday painter, but she became a landlady. She took a little bit of her inheritance, she built a boarding house, and she became a landlady for 15 years, making sun paintings and showing intermittently in the odd exhibition more of like artist society type of shows rather than museum shows. But she'd kind of given up on this particular ambition to have this be her professional life when news of her, she had all the work in her studio in storage and racks up in the attic, and news of her work came to the attention of curators in Eastern Canada who took an interest in her and came to Marius Barbeau and Eric Brown. Barbeau was a leading ethnologist at the time, had done a lot of work on the Northwest Coast, and they heard about her. He came to see her. Barbeau then sent Eric Brown. He went, "Oh my God, this is extraordinary." And she went from being like not on anyone's radar to being the toast of the town in 1927, 28. And then she re-engages with her career as an artist again, but in this other kind of language, which is much more large-scale monumental oil painting meant for display, intended for display in homes or in museums or in institutional context. She was addressing a completely different audience. And she makes those big showpiece paintings for 3 years, like the Crazy Staircase or the wonderful Kitwincool totems or Big Raven or Totem and Forest. Many of the most important paintings that Carr makes are made in that 3-year window immediately after, and also some of her most showy and garish paintings are made during that period, and Eastern Canadian captains of industry bought them all up just the same, without apparent discrimination. She then, which I find very suspicious, stops painting those kind of paintings altogether and stops painting totem poles and villages and goes and starts making the oil and gasoline paintings in the woods, like Happiness or Sunshine and Tumult and other pictures. And she was encouraged to do that by Harris, interestingly, and by another artist, Toby, that she was close to from Seattle. But it's almost, I feel, almost as if she sort of paints herself into a corner and decides this is not feeling great, and makes a complete rupture and break with her past and goes into making the oil and gasoline tree paintings, and then those rapturous oil, sea and sky, oil and gasoline paintings that I showed you at the end of the slides. So it's a fascinating period. But yeah, she gave up for 15 years. It's a long time. She didn't actually reemerge to make all of her important work until she was 56. And all the important work that we look at as being the canonical Emily Carr is after she's 56, 57 years old. So there's some power grannies out there. It's not over till it's over.
Do we have maybe one more question from anyone?
Thank you. Christine, would you bring us up to date on the Massey family or the Massey Foundation in terms of their current role with with Hart House?
I have no idea.
No?
None at all, sorry.
Yes,
Looks like there's a question at the back.
this young lady here has one too.
Hello. The Hart House collection's been in many venues in the last few years, and which venue did you think was the best, and what did you leave out of the exhibition?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't quite...
Yes, the Hart House collection's been all over Canada. So what gallery did the collection look the best in, and what did you leave out of this show?
Oh, yes, I've been asked that today. What did I leave out? It's hard for me to say. I don't think there's a best. I did not actually install any of the at any of the venues, and that's because I was taken on as a contract curator. Justina Barnicky has because it's a contemporary gallery, it doesn't have a historical curator on staff. So I was asked to curate the collection. So I went in and did my work, and then, went out again. I've been on the road with the show, giving talks and tours as the galleries would like me to, but I haven't. I gave direction through the staff there, how I wanted it installed, but everybody has done it differently, so I can't say it looks better in any one place, and I would always do it differently. So it's a very individual thing in making certain juxtapositions and so on. What did I leave out? The plums are in the show. Basically, it's I think all all the pieces that are most recognizable to people who know the collection are in it. Because I was looking at the exhibitions abroad in which these works represented Canada, I think that all the major works are included. I mean, I would put lots of Milnes in. The collection has a lot of great Milnes. You approve of that. So, you know, it'd always be great to put in Milnes. And I thought if the show had been bigger, I would have liked to have included some of the work that was collected before the 1925 collection mandate was taken up, before they brought in the advisory committee of artists, so Harris and later Jackson, and what were the students, when the students had a little more say, what were they acquiring? And the works they were acquiring were smaller, they weren't as important. They might have been in the wilderness, northern wilderness kind of idiom, but they weren't great works of art. And there were a couple of Loveroffs and a T.G. Green, you know. So that would have been interesting to show, you know, what was being created at the same time, in the same spirit, but not at the same level of quality. And that would have been, I think, a more in-depth look at the collection.
There's a young lady in the front here who's been patiently...
Did you have a question? Yeah. Just the mic's coming.
I was just wondering, why do you think Emily Carr's pieces really resonated with particularly Canadians? Why did she become our Emily?
Well, that's a really complicated question. And I mean, on the most superficial level, I think you'd say that obviously they're very formally beautiful. The best of them are very formally, exceptionally strong works of art in terms of composition, color, the way in which she's able to evoke the feeling of the landscape. But that, I don't think, fully does justice to the politics around her art and its deployment in the Canadian nationalist enterprise. And I think I've come to feel that there was a way in which loving Emily Carr and extolling Emily Carr in our national museums and in our the boardrooms of our leading corporations or in the houses of our leading, most wealthy citizens, in a way actually was a kind of wishful act of exoneration from the responsibility for the near extermination of Indigenous people. I think we extolled Carr's paintings of Aboriginal people at the same time that the country was setting about to dismantle their way of life. And this is still something we see today when Aboriginal people are used as an attraction of our nation when we market our country to the world, and even internally to ourselves in terms of our own notion of what our national identity means, at the same time that, you know, 95% of the communities in Canada that don't have potable drinking water are Aboriginal communities. So her work exists within this discussion, and I think there are aspects of this that, you know, that Carr is in no way responsible for. I mean, I don't think an artist is responsible for the ways in which their work is deployed. And I think a lot of the critique around Carr in the 1980s in particular confused Carr with her the people who perpetrated a certain kind of use of her work in a national discussion. And what we were hoping to do in the show is kind of separate those things out and say, you know, what really could Carr see and understand in her day that was deeply wise as well as intelligent and prescient, and to what uses has her work been put in the years afterwards.
Okay, I think we'd better wrap up now. I invite you all to visit the exhibition, and thank you for your questions. And I also invite you to enjoy the refreshments at the other end of the room. I'm sure our guest speakers will be happy to chat with you there. Thanks for coming, and before you go, please join me in thanking Christine and Sarah for a very stimulating discussion today.